Growing up, my sister and I always sat in the front row at church, and this was at the request of our parents, who both sat up on stage in the choir and wanted to be able to keep an eye on us during the service. And Katie and I could usually behave for most of worship, but every once in a while maybe the sermon would run a little long, and as siblings do, we'd start getting a little ornery and pestering each other. So to put an end to that, all Mom had to do was snap her fingers, point in our direction, and give us the look. Every mom in the world has the look, which, without saying a word, conveys a very clear message. You better knock it off, or else. Now, Mom had already told us what or else meant. We were warned that, if necessary, she would get up from her seat in the choir and drag us out of the sanctuary. And my parents were both extremely involved at church, so Katie and I weren't exactly anonymous. Everybody knew who we were. And sitting in the front row meant that if Mom yanked us out, the entire congregation would see us getting in trouble. If we were pulled out to the parking lot, we'd be scolded and rightfully spanked. But I can guarantee you, though, that for us, a spanking was less of a concern than the embarrassment of re-entering the sanctuary, crying, and then sauntering all the way back up to the front row, as the entire congregation could easily guess what had taken place out in the parking lot. Well, we certainly didn't want that, so we never pushed Mom past that breaking point. The snap, point, look warning was sufficient. Well, today we're going to talk about how the story of American independence is ultimately the story of that breaking point being crossed. Every 4th of July, we celebrate the anniversary of declaring independence from Great Britain. But to get a better sense of why the colonies wanted that independence, we're going to look at a roughly 10-year progression of events that can be understood through an analogy of boiling water on a gas stove. Once the burner is lit, things begin to heat up, and that's where our story begins. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris brought a conclusion to the French and Indian War. And the British won the war and held their claim to 13 colonies along the East Coast. Now, the expense of fighting a 7-year war across an ocean resulted in the doubling of Britain's national debt. So to make ends meet, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, which imposed a tax on printed materials in the colonies. Things like magazines, newspapers, legal documents, and playing cards had to be printed on stamped paper. And the revenue from this tax would pay for the British troops that were still stationed here. However, the colonists never feared a follow-up invasion from France, so they didn't feel like the troops needed to stay in the first place. But the bigger issue, though, was that despite being British subjects, the colonists didn't have a voice in Parliament, so this new law sparked anger about taxation without representation. A co-worker of mine once shared a saying that says, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're likely on the menu. And that's exactly what was happening to the colonists. For the British Parliament, it's much easier to pass laws that impact people who not only aren't in the same room, they aren't in the same continent. So if we're boiling water, the Stamp Act has lit the burner. Recognizing that the colonists were furious about paying direct taxes, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but they replaced it with the Townshend Acts, which put tariffs on lead, paper, paint, glass, and tea that was imported into the colonies. And this tariff raised 3 red flags. Number one, those items were not produced locally in North America, so they had to be imported. The colonists were forced to import those goods exclusively from Great Britain, so in effect the British are trying to price gouge their own monopoly. Number 2, regardless of how these fees are levied, the colonists still don't have a voice in Parliament, so we still have the issue of taxation without representation. And number 3, Parliament originally said that they needed money for the British soldiers that were stationed over here, but then their story changed. Now, all of a sudden, the money from these tariffs is going to be used to pay the salaries of the judges and royal governors in the colonies who were appointed by the British. Well, now, back when those salaries were paid by the colonial assemblies, there was still some sense of accountability and local control. Well, not anymore. Under this new law, the colonists are now paying higher prices for key products And in return, their local officials have less accountability to the people they're serving. If the Stamp Act lit the burner, the Townshend Acts brought the water to a boil. In 1773, outrage over this monopoly became so extreme that the Sons of Liberty boarded a ship carrying imported tea from the British East India Company, and they dumped the tea into the harbor. We remember this today as the Boston Tea Party. Parliament was furious when they got the news, so as a means of punishment, they passed another round of laws known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. They started by closing the port in Boston, shutting down all trade until the colonists paid for the dumped out tea. Well, instead of punishing only the individuals responsible for the damages, this punished the entire colony of Massachusetts. Under this new law, almost all of the officials in Massachusetts were now to be appointed by the British. And the accountability of these local governments had already been compromised by the Townshend Acts, so if the public trust was hanging on by a thread, the Intolerable Acts were essentially a pair of scissors. And this lack of trust really snowballed with another part of the law, which said that the royal governor of Massachusetts could allow British officials who were accused of crimes in the colony to have their trial take place back home in Great Britain if the governor felt that they would not receive a fair trial in Massachusetts. Now, if you're a colonist and you want to testify, good luck being able to afford to take the necessary time off work in order to sail to England, stay there for however long the trial lasts, and then sail back home. George Washington referred to that part of the law as the Murder Act because he believed that British officials would now be able to harass or even kill Americans and then quite literally escape justice. And that law seemed even more unfair because an American jury reached a verdict of not guilty for 6 of the 8 British soldiers tried for murder after the Boston Massacre. And the other 2 soldiers got reduced sentences. So if an American jury found British soldiers not guilty of murdering Americans, would a British jury do any different? Well, if the Stamp Act lit the burner and the Townshend Acts brought the water to a boil, the Intolerable Acts had the water boiling over onto the stove. And it was just a matter of time before the situation would result in serious harm. Because with arguably no legal consequences to dissuade the British from committing horrible atrocities, many colonists felt that their last defense against tyranny would be powder and lead. So local militias began training regularly and increasing their store of guns and ammunition. Now, what gets interesting here is that the armed conflict of the Revolutionary War is going to begin because of something that the 2 opposing sides both agree to be true. And I'll illustrate this with 2 examples. First, let's examine this quarter. Heads, we see George Washington. Tails, we see an eagle. Now, regardless of which side you're on, the quarter still represents the same value. And this concept was also true in colonial America, except instead of quarters, we're talking about wooden stock and blued steel. These are the teeth of American liberty. Although on opposite sides of the issue, the British and the colonists both understood that when ordinary hands could possess such an extraordinary instrument, that symbolized the full measure of human dignity and liberty. In other words, both sides knew that as long as the colonists were armed, they were still free. And they both viewed these weapons as being the great equalizer, which leads me to my other example. About 5 years ago, my nephew, who was preschool age at the time, asked me if we could play together with his action figures. Well, sure, why not? So we line his toys up and I pretend to shoot, but he tells me that none of my shots are hitting him because he has an invisible shield. Well, I can see pretty quickly where this is headed. And sure enough, every few minutes my nephew changes the rules so that the toys he's given me have less and less pretend firepower. Well, as you can imagine, that didn't end very well for my side. And it was clear to me that day that preschool boys and tyrannical kings have one thing in common. They are not interested in you being able to defend yourself. They understand the value of weapons, so their objective is to disarm you as quickly as possible. Now, when it's a preschool boy playing with plastic toys, that's not a big deal. When it's a tyrannical king imposing his will on his subjects, we're having a different conversation. Now, our story about colonial America resumes with 700 British troops heading northwest out of Boston to achieve two strategic objectives. First, march to Lexington and arrest key Patriot leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock. And second, press on to Concord and seize guns and ammunition that were being stored by the local militia. This mission was supposed to be rather hush-hush and completed without too much trouble, but history proves that sometimes even the most routine missions can unravel quickly, especially if your enemy is warned that you're coming. Well, in the middle of the night, Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Dr. Samuel Prescott set out on horseback to let the people in the countryside know that the British troops are on the move. And this midnight ride accomplished three things. Number one, it warned Samuel Adams and John Hancock to get the heck out of Dodge. Number two, it warned the folks in Concord to move their weapons to a new hiding place. And number three, it warned all of these local militias that the British were trying to take away the people's last defense against absolute tyranny. And the militia has now determined that there is a price we will not pay. There is a point beyond which the British must not advance. Well, about 5:30 in the morning of April 19th, 1775, the British arrive in Lexington with an advance force of 400 amphibious light infantry Marines under the command of Major John Pitcairn. And they weren't expecting any resistance, but they arrived to the site of 77 armed militiamen under the command of Captain John Parker. Now, Captain Parker knows that the weapons in Concord have already been safely moved. Therefore, his greatly outnumbered force in Lexington doesn't need to block the road. So instead, he lines his men up on the village green. And he orders his men, don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. Well, Major Pitcairn just wanted to get on with the mission, so he yells, "Lay down your arms, you," expletive, "rebels." Captain Parker orders his militia to disperse, but somewhere in the confusion, a shot rang out. And to this day, nobody knows which side pulled the trigger, but that moment became known as the shot heard round the world because it effectively began the American Revolution. The Battle of Lexington only lasted a few minutes because after that first shot, the British charged and quickly scattered the militia. The British killed 8 militiamen without losing any of their own, so the mission kept going. They sent 100 troops ahead to Concord, only to discover that most of the weapons they hoped to confiscate were gone. And they really had no use for the small stash remaining, so they decided to burn it. Now, that whole time, news about Lexington had been spreading. So by now, 400 militiamen had gathered on the north side of Concord. Well, seeing the smoke, the militia thinks that the British are trying to torch the entire town. So they attack. And unlike Lexington, this time the British are outnumbered, so their forces evacuate. Major Pitcairn doesn't know it yet, but his day is about to go from bad to worse. Now, quick pause. Throughout history, military leaders sometimes learn from the misfortunes of others who have gone before. And what's about to happen to the British as they retreat back to Boston may have entered the mind of Japan's Admiral Yamamoto after Pearl Harbor. Legend has it that after the battle, Admiral Yamamoto's journal has an entry saying, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Legend goes on to say that the reason Admiral Yamamoto chose not to press forward with a mainland invasion was because he believed that behind every blade of grass is an American with a rifle. And that was certainly the experience of the British as they retreated back from Concord to Boston. They're already exhausted. They've been awake for over 24 hours. They marched all night from Boston to Lexington, and now they're even farther away in Concord, so they have to retreat 18 miles on foot back to Boston, all while wearing bright red uniforms that make them very easy targets. Meanwhile, news about Lexington has now spread to 27 surrounding communities. So the ranks of the 400 militiamen in Concord has now grown to nearly 4,000 men, who are now shadowing perpendicular on this 18-mile stretch, and they're firing at the British from wooded areas on both sides. And these militiamen are wearing much more muted colors, things like brown, gray, and green that blend very nicely into the forest. Now, the British Army have the best trained soldiers in the world, but they're the best trained in traditional European-style warfare, which is where both sides line up in straight lines, facing each other out in the open, and then exchanging volleys back and forth. They aren't prepared for guerrilla warfare. When militiamen would shoot, the British would try to get everyone lined up in that direction and return fire. Well, this was ineffective because all the militiamen had to do was duck behind the rocks and trees in the woods. Well, when the battle finally ends, the British had suffered more than 3 times as many casualties as the American militia. Earlier, I made a comparison of the progression of the Stamp, Townshend, and Intolerable acts being similar to water boiling over on a stove. And Britain's last straw, though, in Concord, gave birth to even more powerful symbolism, which Benjamin Franklin described in a letter published by the Pennsylvania Gazette in December 1775. 8 months after Lexington and Concord, he saw American Marines displaying imagery we find today on the Gadsden flag. It's got the bright yellow background with a timber rattlesnake and the words, "Don't tread on me." Well, enamored by the image of the rattlesnake, Franklin's letter says, "I recollected that her eye excelled in brightness, that of any other animal, and that she has no eyelids. She may therefore be esteemed an emblem of vigilance. She never begins an attack, nor, when once engaged, ever surrenders. She is therefore an emblem of magnanimity and true courage." As if anxious to prevent all pretensions of quarreling with her, the weapons with which nature has furnished her she conceals in the roof of her mouth, so that, to those who are unacquainted with her, she appears to be a most defenseless animal. And even when those weapons are shown and extended for her defense, they appear weak and contemptible. But their wounds, however small, are decisive and fatal. Conscious of this, she never wounds till she has generously given notice, even to her enemy, and cautioned him against the danger of treading on her. 'Tis curious and amazing to observe how distinct and independent of each other the rattles of this animal are, and yet how firmly they are united together, so as never to be separated but by breaking them to pieces. One of the rattles, singly, is incapable of producing sound, but the ringing of 13 together is sufficient to alarm the boldest man living. You can imagine how a mind with that much brilliance and wisdom could be effective in convincing the Continental Congress to support independence. In the musical 1776, Benjamin Franklin's character says, "Never was such a valuable possession so recklessly managed than this entire continent by the British Crown. Our industry discouraged, our resources pillaged, and worst of all, our very character stifled. We've spawned a new race here, rougher, simpler, more violent, more enterprising, less refined. We're a new nationality. We require a new nation." Forming this new nation would start with drafting a Declaration of Independence. In his words, Thomas Jefferson sought to place before mankind the common sense of the subject in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent. And in so doing, we could justify ourselves in the independent stand we are compelled to take. As we close today, I'm going to read a few abbreviated excerpts from the Declaration. And while I do, I want you to think about the progression of the Stamp, Townshend, and Intolerable Acts. taxation without representation, prices going up, accountability going down, monopoly in the ports, murder in the streets. Picture that water boiling on the stove. Think about Major Pitcairn hoping to pull the last remaining teeth of American liberty. Remember what awaited him behind every blade of grass. Think about the sleeping giant and the terrible resolve. Picture that rattlesnake who just wanted to be left alone, who gave ample warning to back off, but when tyranny's heel came down, ooh, she retaliated with one heck of a bite. Now hear these words from our declaration. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them to another, a decent respect requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince, whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant, is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. We therefore declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Amen.